Thank you very much, Henriette, and also thank you, Lisa, for all of your hard work putting this together. Good morning and welcome to the first in our lecture series of Jews and Sports, sponsored by ASU Jewish Studies. Today we're going to learn about American Jews and sports fandom, and then please join us again on March 24th. I know it's a little bit in the distance. March 24th for the second installment, What, If Anything, is Jewish in Sport? And that will be on Zoom, thank you. ASU Jewish Studies serves as an intellectual home for the study of Jewish history, religion, and thought. Through our academic programs and public events, we are committed to sharing credible scholarship, encouraging thoughtful discussion, and inviting inquiry into the Jewish experience. Our programs are free and open to everyone, regardless of background or identity. They are grounded in rigorous academic study and take place alongside lived Jewish life here in our community. Together, they reflect our belief that Jewish studies belongs both in the university and in the public sphere as a serious intellectual endeavor that speaks to a wide and diverse audience. Now let me introduce our speaker, my colleague in the School of Historical Philosophical Religious Studies, Shawn Klein, who is an associate teaching professor in the School of Historical Philosophical and Religious Studies, ASU. He specializes in ethics, popular culture, and the philosophy of sport. He is the editor of several books, including Defining Sport, Conceptions and Borderlines from Lexington Books in 2016, Steve Jobs and Philosophy, For Those Who Think Different, from Open Court Books in 2015, and Harry Potter in Philosophy, If Aristotle Ran Hogwarts, Open Court 2004. He is the general editor of Studies in Philosophy of Sport, a book series from Lexington Books. He is the editor-in-chief for Reasoned Papers, a journal of interdisciplinary normative studies. He has presented at numerous conferences on sports ethics, business ethics, pop culture, and philosophy, and other topics. Here's where it gets really cool. Klein blogs and podcasts at sportsethics.com, and he has appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Boston Globe, Bloomberg News, CNN, CNBC, ESPN, and other media outlets. Originally from Massachusetts, he is a fan of all things Boston sports, and we can be friends with him anyway. And he lives in Phoenix, Arizona with his wife, son, and several pets, and I know that the pets send their regrets that they couldn't be here today. Okay, thank you very much, Shawn.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, everyone can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, so as Stanley said, I teach philosophy at ASU, and my intellectual specialty is in the philosophy of sports ethics. I also have done philosophy, pop culture philosophy, and sport in a lot of ways is a kind of pop culture. And so that is the natural progression of thinking about Harry Potter, and Quidditch, I guess, and ending up talking about philosophy of sports. And I'm fascinated by the phenomenon of sport, as well as play and games, and the phenomenon of sport, of how it affects our lives, is in our lives, tells us about the human experience. And I think studying sport and how sport affects our lives tells us a lot about what it is to be a human being and how to live our lives as well. But I don't know if you can tell, I'm not really an athlete. I don't feel like I look like an athlete. I was never really an athlete at all. The highlight of my athletic career was probably junior or senior year as a volleyball player, and I came in to serve, and I served out the whole remaining points of the game, and that was the highlight of my athletic career. It's all been downhill since. So I come to sports personally as a fan. And I've been a fan of sports for a long time. And so when I had the opportunity to speak about Jews and sports, I knew I wanted to do something about being a fan and being Jewish, because both of those are important parts of who I am and very personal to me. And so I wanted to think about that more and think about what is it to be Jewish, to be an American, to be a sports fan. Now, is there something unique about Jewish sports fandom? And I don't really think there is something really unique. I don't think the experience, the way that Jews relate and identify with Jewish players, Jewish teams, the Israeli national teams, is really all that different than the way Mexican Americans, Irish, Italian Americans relate to Irish, Italian, Brazilian, Mexican, so on, players in American sports, as well as their national teams as well. So I think there's a lot of similarities there. But even though there are parallel, similar experiences of other groups through sports fandom, I think there are some really interesting things that we can see and talk about when we look at being Jewish, being American, and being a sports fan. At least I hope so, because that's why we're here, right? So a couple of challenges or things to think about, like in the background, just sort of that won't necessarily talk directly to, but I think we should kind of get out of the way, make sure that we understand that these are some challenges here. So first is the sort of classic question of who is a Jew, right? Who counts as a Jew? What is it to be Jewish? How broad or how narrow should we make that question? All right, there's folks in Jewish sports that themselves might be identified as being Jewish, but aren't Jewish or don't see themselves as Jewish, right? Or might be part of the Jewish community in some way because they're married into it, but then they themselves are not necessarily Jewish, and so on. So there's, do we include them in this sort of category? What is it to be a Jew? And I'm not going to tackle that at all. That's too thorny of a subject. But I just think that if we're going to talk about the Jewish sports experience, right, what does it mean to be Jewish then, right? So that is something in the background that would have to be fleshed out more. I take a very broad view of that. But kind of related to that is a question about a Jewish experience or many Jewish experiences, right? Because there's lots of different ways to be Jewish. Even if we take a more narrow sense of what it is to be Jewish, there's still lots of different ways to be Jewish, right? According to Pew Research, American Jews are about 70% Ashkenazi, so that's Central Eastern European of origin. But that means about 30% are not, right? They're Sephardic, Mizrahi, other kinds of Jews. And so much of what I'm going to focus on is the Ashkenazi Jewish experience. And that's largely more representative of the American Jewish experience, but it might not match up to Sephardic or Mizrahi or other Jewish experiences in America. I just don't know how a Sephardic community in Texas relates to Sandy Koufax. Is that going to be the same kind of relationship that many of us in the room might have with our background? I don't know. But it's there. I think we should acknowledge that there might be other Jewish experiences that are not identical to the sort of main Jewish experience or bigger picture Jewish experience. Another sort of caveat here is that most of the research within philosophy of sport and areas of sport are really much more focused on athletes more directly and the participants in sports, which makes sense. The media coverage and also the institutions like ownership and leagues and whatnot. There's not as much on the experience of the sports fan directly. And when there is, it's more qualitative. It's more people telling a story. So in a biography about, Jane Levy's Sandy Koufax biography, which is something I really recommend, and I'll probably reference it later as well. She talked a lot to people that when they were little kids were fans, and now they're recounting their experience. And so that's an important bit of information, but it's one person's perspective. So there's not as much broad-based data to draw on. I think that experience, we have to sort of pull back a little bit from what we know about the athletes and the institutions and the bigger picture to try to figure out what is the fan focus and fan experience. Another sort of caveat related to this as well is that a lot of what I'm going to be focusing on is more baseball. And that's partly because I love baseball, but also because a lot of the focus, particularly within the Jewish sports history period, is more heavily focused on baseball, which is not to say that Jews weren't involved very much in other sports, basketball, boxing, and so on, and that there aren't large Jewish sports fan bases in those sports as well. It's just that when we start to look, a lot of the stuff is much more focused within baseball. So for a lot of my approach, it will be through the lens of baseball. What do you do with my water? Here it is. So Switching then, now we're beginning to step into the subject a little bit more, talking about, well, what is fandom? And so in philosophy of sport, as well as psychology and sociology of sport, there's this small growing literature body of articles and books and studies about what it is to be a sports fan. Right? Why are we fans? How do we become fans? Why do we stay fans? All right? What kinds of different fans are there? Right? So there's fans that are of college versus professional. There's fans that are dedicated to really following one team as a loyal supporter. All right? Or several teams. But then there's fans that are, they love basketball and they don't care who's playing or who in any particular game, who wins, they just want to watch, right? And so that's a different kind of fan than the kind of fan I am, which lives and dies by what happens 1,000 miles away, all right? Which takes me to what I think is really the most interesting question about sports fandom, which is why do we care so much, right? Why does something that doesn't really affect us directly, right? So later this afternoon, there will be a game played in Denver that will determine how happy I'm going to be for the next week or not. And that's really kind of insane in some ways, right? Win or lose, why does it matter? Why does it feel like it matters more than almost anything else? And so this is a picture of me later today if the Patriots lose. No. So that's actually from, I think, 2 World Cups ago, a Brazilian soccer fan after the Brazilian team got shellacked, I think, by Germany. And so she's very upset, but, really, does it really matter? Is she any poorer or any richer the next day because of the team? Unless you gambled a lot of money, I guess, right? But no prettier, no uglier than win or lose on the team. So why? But it does seem to really matter quite a lot for us, even though it seems like it's just a game. And so I think one way to help us understand this is to compare it and think about the way we care about stories, the way we care about fiction, TV, movies, books, right? Because those are just stories, right? But we can care a lot about what happens in that. I remember, I might have been 10 years old, and we read Where the Red Fern Grows. Anyone know that book? Right? I don't really remember what it's about. I mean, I know one thing that it's about. It's about 2 hunting dogs that die. And I still can feel in my gut the sadness of having read that. But I don't remember anything else about the book, right? But that stuck with me, that emotion, right? But those dogs aren't real. They were on a page, right? And then I think about having read Watership Down and then reading it to my son. And we get to the point where one of the main characters, which is a bunny rabbit, because it's about bunnies, rabbits, fighting oppression. And one of them, you think the main character has died. And the character hasn't, but my son was distraught, right? Didn't want to even finish the book. And it took us a while to kind of talk him back to it. You mentioned Harry Potter. I'm re-listening to the Harry Potter books. They have been re-releasing them as full cast performances. I highly recommend listening to these if you're a Harry Potter fan. But I can't tell you how much I get so mad when Draco Malfoy comes onto the scene, right? I just can't stand him. And, right, so, but he's not a real person, right? Why do I despise these words on a page? But this is part of the way our imagination works. Right? We are able to imagine these things happening through the power of fiction and movies. And through that, we have desires, we have emotions, we have fears, we have joys that are based on these imaginings. And that these emotions can lead us to react in similar ways and connect to our memory in similar ways to real world scenarios. Now, not exactly the same. They don't have the same function when you're watching ER, or well, that's a dated reference, right? Or you're watching like the Bosch show and someone gets murdered on the TV. You don't pick up the phone and call the police, right? So we know the difference here, right? We know that it's not actually happening, but we can feel the concern. We can feel the desire, the joy when something good happens, the sadness when a character that we love dies. And so it's a powerful thing that fiction can do, that imagination can do as we interact with it. And they allow us to have these experiences when we're watching movies, reading literature that are very real, but also fictional. And so fictional is not necessarily the opposite of real. We have these real emotions. They're real, even if they're responding, in a sense, to something fictional. And so the imagination and the corresponding emotions are an essential reason why we love and engage with literature, with fiction, with movies, and so on. And I think the experience of being a sports fan is similar to this. Not exactly the same, right? Athletes and games are not fictional. They are playing them, right? Things will happen this afternoon that really do happen. They're not just happening on a page. People might even get hurt, right, in real ways. But we have stories and narratives about our fandom, ways of thinking about the game and interacting that are kind of like fiction stories. There's a social element as well to being a fan, right? And that's a key part of one's fandom. Fans are almost always part of a community of fans. It might be a far-flung community or it might be a local community, but it's almost always within a community. There's almost always someone that you can pick up the phone or send a text and say, can you believe that happened? Or, oh my God, this is great that this happened, right? So it's within a community, and this really structures the way that we consume and interact with fandom. And so, and this is really the only sort of academic jargony sort of language that I'm going to use today, but I talk about sports fandom as a socially collaborative fiction or narrative. All right, and so what that means is that it's a kind of story that we write together, or that I write in inverted commas here, because obviously it's not written, but through our interaction, through our conversations that we have with each other and our experiences and sharing the moments of sport and recalling through history our experiences with it, we create kinds of stories about that fandom and it tells us about ourselves, about our fandom, about other fandoms, and other fans of the sport. And so it's collaborative that we do this together, right? And so it's, I forgot to fix that, right? But this says written by fans, journalists, media, advertising, right? So these things come up throughout the experience of fandom that's written by fans through our interaction with each other, and that we have a kind of folklore, right? Stories that we tell each other about ourselves and how we understand ourselves. So I have here on the screen the Curse of the Billy Goat, right, for the Cubs. And we could also I could have done something for the Curse of the Bambino for the Red Sox, right? And so those were stories, neither of which are actual, right? Curses aren't real, at least I don't think they are, right? But these were stories that the Cubs fan bases and the Red Sox fan bases told themselves about their experience. It's a way that they consumed and understood their experiences as a fan of the Red Sox or the Cubs. And then also I have a picture of Matthew Slater, a former Patriot standout on special teams and leader, and he has a t-shirt, I don't know if you can read it, but it says New England versus everybody, right? And so that is a way that New England fans, Boston fans understand themselves against the world, right? And it's a kind of even a Boston thing too, right? Not even just with sports. There's a very kind of provincial sort of, it's Boston, we're the hub of the universe, really, right? It's a small little city, right? But we think of ourselves as this way and against everybody. And that's been part of the sports fandom as well. And it's part of, real or not, it's part of how Boston fans understand themselves, as well as that attitude. It gets reflected in the way others see the Boston fan base as well. And that's part of that story. And these stories are passed down generation to generation, fans to fans, and these stories are part of the narrative about ourselves and that define and express our fandom. Right? And so this narrative that we develop, the story that we tell about ourselves, informs who we are as fans, informs our fandom, and also evolves and grows. That's also part of the collaborative, that with each iteration of fans, it expands and grows and changes in different ways. And so I think when we think about Jewish sports fans, right, I think there are a number of interesting ways that we can talk about certain kinds of narratives or stories or even broader themes that are interesting about how to understand ourselves as Jewish sports fans, right? That are going to inform what it is to be Jewish and a sports fan in America. Now, it's not connected to a team the way the Curse of the Billy Goat is, or New England versus everybody is, but it's connected to something Jewish, right? Whether it's a Jewish athlete or Jewish owner or Jewish connected team like the Israel national team. And as folklore, right, they're not precisely historical, but they are going to capture certain kinds of truths about the Jewish experience as a sports fan. The first one I want to talk about is this nickname that gets carried on throughout Jewish sports of the Hebrew Hammer. Right, and so there are lots and lots of Jewish athletes that have this nickname, right? Most famously is Hank Greenberg, was, I don't want to say the original Hebrew Hammer, all right, but that's maybe in some ways the most famous. Then there's Al Rosen, was also known as the Hebrew Hammer, and he is in like the 40s and the 50s, I think is his career. And there's a boxer over there known as the Hebrew Hammer, and also next month, or less than that, right? We're going to see Israel's first ever bobsled team. They qualified just last week, and it is really driven by A.J. Edelman, who competed as a skeleton racer and is known as the Hebrew Hammer, right? So it's across sports, and this imagery just keeps coming up and up again within Jewish sports. And there's probably an obvious reason for that, because of the connection to Maccabees. Maccabee means hammer, and who's more ferocious and tough guy Jew than the Maccabees, right? And so if you want to capture a kind of narrative about what it is to be a tough, athletic, ferocious Jew, then connecting yourself in some way to the Maccabee, which we also do with the Maccabee Games as well. And so that sent that contra stereotype, that going against the stereotype of Jews as bookish, non-athletic, right? And so when there are strong Jewish athletes with strong Jewish identities, we glom onto them. We follow them out. We celebrate those Jewish fans, and that's where the notion of the Hebrew Hammer kind of fits in. There's a scholar, Rebecca Albert, who has a phrase, she uses the phrase macho mensch, which I love. And it's really referring to these kinds of characters who are athletic, strong Jews, and they're also strongly Jewish, right? They connect to their Jewish identity. It's an important part of who they are, and they're good people, right? They're good characters. They're well respected. And Greenberg and Koufax are the two that she focuses on the most because they are two of the really truest macho mensches that you can think of. Now, so that's sort of one overarching sort of narrative about Jewish sports fans. But there's sort of three narratives of Jewish experience that I want to talk about and they kind of filter through three eras roughly. I don't think they're exclusively to that era, sort of like the 30s and then the post-war period and then more contemporary. And I think they mix together, but they do kind of group somewhat historically. And so the three of them are, first, a period or a focus on assimilation, right? So this is the fan as being a good American. And so fandom, Jewish fandom was a way of expressing oneself as a good American. And then I think there's a period or focus or narrative about really fandom as affirming our Jewish identity. So it's less about assimilation and trying to show that we're good Americans, but showing that and affirming that we're Jewish Americans, right? And so it's a different emphasis. And then more contemporary to our, the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, and aughts is a kind of ambivalence where Jewishness of one's fandom moves more into the background, doesn't disappear, but seems to be a little bit less important. So I want to talk about each of these, and I have a kind of stand-in for each. So under assimilation, right, we have the 1934 baseball season, and Hank Greenberg's team, the Detroit Tigers, are in a pennant race, and it's colliding with the Jewish high holidays, right? And so this leads to a lot of discussion. Hank Greenberg is the star of that team. He's one of the best players in all of baseball, and they need him, right? They are, as the headline, if you can see, it says that their lead is 4.5 games. This is a point in the season, there was about 20 games left. All right, so their lead in the pennant race was pretty precarious, and they needed Greenberg to play. And so there's this big question about should he play or should he pray, right? Should he not play on Rosh Hashanah? And it turns out, and so there's a huge discussion, right? The media weighs in, Gentile press, Jewish press, rabbis weigh in, communities across America, Jewish communities across America are weighing in, giving Greenberg advice about what he should or shouldn't do. And Greenberg plays on Rosh Hashanah, and he hits 2 home runs and beats the Red Sox, right? But it's all good because it meant that the Yankees got pushed down further down the standing. So that's always good. First the Red Sox and then anyone playing the Yankees. And, all right, and so he plays and decides to play, and he does it because the pennant's on the line. His community needs him. His baseball community needs him. Detroit needs him. His team needs him. And to do that, then he decides to play. And he's lauded for this. He's praised widely, both in the Gentile regular press, but also the Jewish press. The Detroit Jewish Chronicle, the Jewish Daily Bulletin, all have articles praising him, portraying it as a noble sacrifice for his community, doing his civic duty for his community, right? Serving his fellow man on the Jewish holy day. And all right, and so we see here that Jewish fans of that time, right, they wanted to show that they were assimilated, that they are as American as everybody else, as willing and able to do their civic baseball duty as any other American. I think we also have to recognize there's probably a little bit of a fear of a backlash, an anti-Semitic backlash. If Greenberg doesn't play and then they lose, right, what kind of impact would that have? Which, of course, is always a double-edged sword of assimilation. Can you ever assimilate enough, right? Now, a week later, though, is Yom Kippur, and now Greenberg doesn't play. He does sit out on Yom Kippur. And this, too, is also widely respected and praised, both by Gentile press and the Jewish press. The non-Jewish press respects his commitment to his own faith, and there's this famous poem by Edward Guest that was published in the Detroit Free Press at the time. Afterwards, it's longer than this, but this is the last line. We shall miss him on the infield and shall miss him at the bat, but he's true to his religion, and I honor him for that. So he's praised and respected for honoring his religion, and the Jews respect him for not violating Yom Kippur, right? And so now some context, by the time we get to Yom Kippur, Detroit has a 7-game lead, and there's only 10 games left, right? So he's not as needed. But also, right, I don't mean that cynically either, but right, so his duty to his community was done on Rosh Hashanah, right, to his sport community. So now he was free to serve his Jewish community. So he could be both a good Jew and a good American in this way, doing his duty to his community, but also both communities, right, his American community and his Jewish communities. And so this allows fans, particularly of that time period, but even today, for us to look back and relate to that struggle with assimilation, to balancing our Jewishness and our Americanness. Well. And now, moving time-wise into post-World War II period, post-48, founding of Israel, the Jewish sense of place in the world is different, more secure in America for sure, right? And we have the 1965 Dodgers and Twins World Series. And this is in some ways no more famous moment in Jewish American sports, I think, is Sandy Koufax not starting game 1 of the World Series, right? Because it falls on Yom Kippur, and so he chooses not to play. And so in some ways this is pretty similar to Greenberg's scenario, but the push and pull controversy, should he play, shouldn't he play, was just not as much. Not that it wasn't there at all, right? But it just wasn't the story, right, as much. The story was he wasn't going to play. The story wasn't should he or should he not play. The story was he wasn't going to play, right? And this headline, I think, captures that really well, right? Koufax can't pitch World Series. It's Yom Kippur. It's not should he pitch, what are we going to do, should he or should he not. It's Yom Kippur. He's Jewish. He's not going to pitch, right? And so that sense of affirmation of the strength of Jewish identity, of being more at comfort with Jews in the Jews' place in America and in the world, right? Koufax doesn't have to explain himself, doesn't have to justify himself, doesn't have to seek a rabbinic dispensation, which reportedly Greenberg sought, right? Even though that's not really a thing. But there was one of the rabbis in Detroit did say, no, he can play. It's okay. I found a place in the Talmud where they played ball on Yom Kippur, so you can go ahead and play, right? And so, but the acceptance, right? That sense of not having to seek out dispensation, that sense of didn't have to justify himself, also carried to the Jewish fans as well, that they didn't have to justify themselves. And this is, I mentioned Jane Levy's Sandy Koufax biography. She talks a lot about this, that many of the Jews at the time report that very experience, that sense of not having to explain themselves to others, not having to tell their teacher and try to justify why they weren't going to be on school in Yom Kippur, and so on, that they now had a strong affirmed place of their identity of being a Jewish American, right? And it wasn't something that needed further justification, all right? And I think that's what marks, I think, Greenberg differently than Koufax. Greenberg, there was more of a question of this conflict, whereas by the time you get to Koufax is more of a question of this is just who he is, and that's what he's going to do. I don't want to suggest that there wasn't any kind of conflict and controversy about it, but it was the sound levels were much lower when it came to Koufax. Now moving forward into this period of ambivalence is a period where I think that sense of the Jewishness of our fandom is more in the background. And this, I use Shawn Green to highlight this, who's a high-profile Jewish player around the turn of the millennium, I guess, right? Turn of the century, and started with Toronto and then was traded to the Dodgers. And all right, so there was a conflict that comes, again, for playing on the high holy days, and Green is torn by this. At times early in his career, he did play, and sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. After 9/11, for the 2001 playoffs, he decides it's important that he sit, right? And with the connection to all that was going on at that time, and so he does sit. And then in 2004, Yom Kippur is on a Saturday, right, and starts on Friday evening. Well, the Dodgers were going to play a Friday night game and a Saturday game. So if he was going to sit out for Yom Kippur, he'd have to miss 2 games. So in an ambivalent period, how do you do that? You split the difference. He played in one game and he sat another game, right? And I think that captures that sense of ambivalence here of kind of a little bit of both, right? And this just wasn't really as a story, the way Koufax was or Greenberg was. Now, part of that, Green, he's a good player, was never the player that Koufax and Greenberg were, not at that level. He was good at the time, he was one of the better players in the league at the time. But it just wasn't as big of a story. It wasn't a nothing story, but it wasn't the national story. Probably if you weren't a Dodgers fan at that time, you probably weren't even aware of it, right? Whereas if you were a baseball fan in '65, you were aware of the Koufax thing, even if you didn't care about the Dodgers at all. Right? And so the presence of Jewish players in sports also is less of a major news story. It's not something that's highlighted as much, right? Just not major news stories anymore. And some play on the holidays, some don't, right? It's really seen as a personal choice and not major stories anymore. And the fact of the athletes being Jewish often isn't even mentioned, and there's lots of athletes that we may not even realize are Jewish, right? And so I have Kevin Youkilis, who by now, most people I think know he's Jewish because he's been more outspoken about his identity, but in his playing days, he didn't hide it, but it really wasn't a story, right? In fact, in the Moneyball books, he's referred to as the Greek god of walks, right? Because he would walk a lot. Right, and in the idea of Moneyball was walking is just as good as a single because you get on base, right? And so that was highly valued, and that's what allowed Youkilis to, in some ways, to have a career. All right, and there's a famous scene when he's playing for the Red Sox, and I'm drawing a blank on the comedian's name, but he was in the booth, and he said something about, oh, isn't he Greek? And the announcer says, no, I think he's Jewish. He's Jewish, right? Like, he didn't even know, right? And it didn't matter, right? It just wasn't as big a deal. And then we have Sue Bird, who's an WNBA superstar, or in her playing days. Right now, I think she's president of the women's basketball team, women's national basketball team at this point. And so within the women's basketball world, she's bigger than Koufax, right? I mean, she's huge. And I don't know how many, I didn't know she was Jewish until I started doing preparation for this, right? So it's not, again, that's not that she hides it, right? She also has Israeli dual citizenship for Israel. And so there's a sense of, well, they're Jewish, like, that's cool, right? And you'll see a story in Kaveller.org or JTA in the email or something like that about it, but it's just not something that really bubbles up too much, right? And there is that sense that I think in the Greenberg and Koufax days, Jewish fans followed Jewish athletes, right? They knew who the Jewish athletes were, they tracked them even if they weren't on our team. And I think in this period, it becomes less of a thing, right? It's like, oh, cool, right? But it's not something that we really track as much. But I think it's still important that it still is partly something that is not irrelevant or ignored for Jewish sports fans. It's just not as central as it was. That connection to Jewish athletes in some ways is more of a kind of nostalgia, right? Or, and part of that, I think I have this limited card set from American Jewish Historical, which is called the Jewish Major Leaguers Baseball Cards, right? And I've never opened them because I'm hoping someday this will be worth something, but probably not, right? Well, you never know, right? And so, but this is a product of nostalgia and of excitement, but not something that has the same impact, I think, that something like that might have had in the 60s or in the 30s with someone like Greenberg. But we still see the relevance, and so particularly nowadays, I think particularly when they're not just that they're Jewish, but they might be Orthodox or more traditionally observant, right? And so back in the early 2000s, there was a basketball player coming out of New Jersey, Tamir Goodman, and he picked up the nickname Jewish Jordan, right, as in Michael Jordan, right? So he was going to be the Jewish Jordan, and he was Orthodox, right, and wouldn't play on the Sabbath and so on, right, and but didn't. We haven't really heard from him since, and so he obviously didn't pan out as the Jewish Jordan, all right, but he did play and is still involved. Right, but that was a story, right, and even got a book out of it, right, and is something that people did pay attention to. So there are news stories that highlight these things. And more recently, not this past season, but the season before that, there was Jake Retzlaff was playing for BYU of all places, and was Jewish. I don't actually think he's Orthodox, but he did land an NIL deal with Manischewitz. Right, it's probably the only NIL deal with Manischewitz. All right, and he's since transferred from BYU. I don't know where. But these were stories, and they're stories because they're fun, right? They're interesting little news items, but they're not like what the stories would have been, 70 years ago. There's also the bad side here as well, right? The Shondas. As we might say, of those that are bad behaving Jews in sport, owners like Don Sterling, but also here we have Ryan Braun, whose relationship to Judaism is probably a little bit more complicated, but is recognized as characterized as a Jewish player, and was also involved in the steroids era and scandal of baseball, and so has sort of since disappeared from the scene. Right, and so that becomes a news story, and his Jewishness becomes a news story in part because he tried to appeal to anti-Semitism as well, right? And so that wasn't totally cool. But I think what a lot of this shows is that the Jewish fandom has more or less spread out. It's less about following particularly Jewish sports stars, and it shows a wider comfort and ease at being a Jewish American sports fan. But I think this period of ambivalence might be coming to a bit of an end. And so I add a fourth A here, right? because I don't know if Hebrew hammer, and then I have all these A's. I kind of like alliteration. And so here we have the fourth A, awakening. And this awakening is really in two senses, right? So one is an awakening of anti-Jewish sentiments that unfortunately we've been seeing for a period now, right? And I think that's a story or a narrative that's really still in its early stages, right? And maybe hopefully doesn't pan out in the worst ways that we can imagine, right? But that reawakening of those sentiments from the past and exclusion, and we've seen not so much in American sports, but we have seen this in Europe with Israeli teams coming and playing in Europe, exclusion of fans from being able to go in that are supporting the Israeli team, and even violence around the stadiums. We haven't seen anything like that in the U.S., and I don't think we actually would, but there is this awakening of that sentiment. But on the positive side, I think there's also awakening of a Jewish connection to athletes that are open and strong with their Jewish identity, right, and connecting to it, right? And so Harrison Bader, and I put a circled, the little red circle if you can't see it, but here there's a Jewish star on his belt, and Harrison Bader also plays for the Israel national team and the Israel baseball national team. And then Alex Bregman, after 10-7, drew that star on his hat as well. And so I think there's a stronger identification that's growing with Jews that play sports that have a visible identity, and an excitement amongst Jewish fans about that, about being seen and represented by those fans, particularly in connection to the awakening of anti-Jewish sentiments. And I think this also relates to, as I mentioned, right, that Harrison Bader plays for the Israel baseball team, and the support that the Israel national baseball team gets from American Jews is really big, right? There's a lot there in terms of buying merchandise. I brought a little prop, right? Brand new hat for this new season, right? For the Israel baseball team, and so they're playing again. I think it starts in March, early March. Israel is playing in Miami. I think their first game is against Venezuela, right? But they were sort of the Cinderella team in 2017, and they also played in 2023 and 2020, and will be playing in 2026. And so here you have obviously a Detroit Tiger fan who's showing up wearing Israel baseball gear to support the Israel baseball team. And then here's Kevin Youkilis again when he was coaching with the team, right? And so part of the American support is because there's a lot of American players, American Jews that play on the team, because the way the World Baseball Classic works is if you're eligible for citizen, you don't have to be a citizen, you just have to be eligible for a citizen in the country. So American Jews, in virtue of law of return, are eligible for Jewish citizenship. And so a lot of Jewish American players play on the team, such as Harrison Bader. And Dean Kremer, who's a pitcher for the Orioles, it's been a standout for them for a long time. Is he also partly Israeli? Oh, okay, yeah. So that's even a stronger connection, right? And so that the financial support, the emotional support, the fan support, that's pretty massive, and I think has helped that team be able to sustain. Even though within Israel, baseball is barely a thing, right? Even in 2017, as Israel was making its way through the competition, was barely covered in Israel. So the American support is really what drives the team baseball for Israel, and I think that predates 10-7, obviously, and predates some of that, but I think it's still part of that awakening of that Jewish fan experience, a Jewish sports fan experience, with a connection to Jewish players that are vocal about their Jewish experience, but also Jewish players that are willing to play for the Israel national team. So now there are lots of different ways to approach this, right? Other kinds of narratives that we could focus on. I hope that by focusing on these highlights, elements of being a sports fan, a Jewish sports fan, the stories that we tell ourselves about our Jewish fandom, about being Jews, about being Americans, about being sports fans, and I hope that this has helped to enrich and deepen our sense of being Jewish fans, what that means, and how that will continue to evolve into the future. So, thank you.
Yeah, we have to use the mic even in the room for the guests that are on Zoom. And maybe I can add a fifth A, Auerbach, especially for a Boston fan, Red Auerbach, maybe the Jew that won the most, and it's American sports. Thank you very much. So anyone have questions here in the room?
Bud Selig was also Jewish. What impact do you think the ambivalence has changed since the 30s and 40s today because of the changes in how we get our news and process our information, with the obvious social media and all of that? Has that affected it, the ambivalence? And also, is it the fact that we just don't have that Hank Greenberg today that they did back then? There's no standout, amazing Jewish sports figure.
Yeah, so the question is, let me make sure I can summarize it. So one is part of the ambivalence in more of our current era connected to social media, the internet, the ways that we consume media today that's different than it was back in the day. So that's the first part of your question. And the second one is part of it connected to that we don't have a Greenberg or a Koufax in the same way that we did back then. I guess, let's see, I'll tackle the second question first. Go in reverse order. And so I think that the fact that we don't necessarily have that standout, that Greenberg and Koufax were the very tippity top of their profession, right? We have many good Jewish athletes today. So part of it too is not just that we don't necessarily have someone of Greenberg or Koufax's stature, there's just more as well. Right, which might be surprising, but I think, I don't have the statistics off my head, but I think more recently there's probably more Jews in baseball in the last 20 years than there were before that, all right, and in Greenberg's day and in Koufax's day. So not only were they athletically standing out because of their excellence, but they're also standing out because they were one of a very few number, whereas now, even if they are more at the top of the game, like a Shawn Green, who was top, like not the same level, but there's more players. All right, I think there's more players in general, so the percentages might not work out quite the same, but just in terms of the absolute numbers, there's more. So I think, but not having the standout who becomes a focal point, I think is part of that. But we also don't necessarily look to have the focal point either, because it's not, I think part of it is we don't necessarily need it as much, right? Because I think Jews are more comfortable in America, right? Certainly prior to 10/7, I think that sense of being very comfortable, of being knitted into the experience of American experience. And I think that's still largely true. I think the 10/8 Jewish phenomenon, I think is important and is real and is part of that awakening. And I do think that will shift the way American Jews think about themselves in American society, and that will also have an impact on how they'll think about themselves vis-a-vis sport, and they may actually begin to look more for Jewish great athletes and focus on them. As a Boston fan, I was hoping to focus on Alex Bregman a lot more, but he left. He went to the Cubs, so yeah. But in terms of the media, I do think that's an impact, right? In the 30s and in the 60s, right, it's newspaper. Right, everything's through the newspapers, and the newspaper media is able to control the story. Not in a malevolent kind of malicious way, but they're the main outlet. Whereas now, it's 1,000 flowers or more 1,000 weeds blooming, right? And so there's a lot more ways to get news, and there's a lot. But that I think also can help because we probably wouldn't know about the Tamir Goodmans or the Jake Ratzliffs of the world. Like we're going to pick out those smaller stories that aren't going to be national stories, but they'll get picked up by Jewish media and Jewish sources and various Jewish Instagram accounts and stuff that will share and that my mom will send me. Like, did you see this great story about this Jewish athlete, right? So, and so that I think the media can it helps spread things out, but it also can help us find new stuff as well. So does that answer your question? Okay, good.
Professor, it was an outstanding presentation. I can't thank you enough. I'm going to ask you a question. You choose not to answer it. My background as a hypnotherapist for 30 years, sports serves as a distraction from other things that people want to get away from. That's my perception. Other people have different perceptions. So my question as an ASU professor, your last slide talked about anti-Semitism. if you're willing to address the anti-Semitism that may be occurring on the ASU campus, and you could choose not to answer that if you don't want to.
I mean, what I would, I'm not going to address it whole cloth, right, or big picture, right, because I'm not necessarily in a position to do that, and there's a lot of stuff that has happened. I do think ASU it's not Columbia, that's for sure, right? And I personally have not come across really anything, maybe, you know, a poster here or there, or some stuff spray painted on a sidewalk. But by and large, the administration has worked really well, both with Hillel and the Irish Jewish studies, and the, we have a, yes, thank you. The Jewish faculty and staff group. And so they're very much all working together. I mean, of course, there's going to be anti-Semitism, there's anti-Zionism, and that's going to be there. And there are faculty that do express what I would regard as beyond the pale views, right? But that's part of free speech, intellectual freedom, and so on. But I think ASU has actually handled a lot of that stuff fairly well. So, yeah.
Anyone with a question in the room? Oh, okay.
Maybe it's not a question, it's just a request. My name is Rose, and I don't know nothing about sports and nothing about baseball. But I have a 9-year-old grandson who is involved to the maximum. You know, he loved the sports. He's played Little League, and he's, you know, and his parents are very much involved. The presentation was just amazing for me to hear the names, and I would like to know if I can, I don't know if I need the whole presentation, but just this little piece of those famous baseball players, what you mentioned. Where can I find this, or can that be available in some kind of a brochure? Because
YouTube, yeah. So the video, this talk will be on YouTube, on the Jewish Studies YouTube page. And there's my email, and the email's on the handout, and I'd be happy to send you a PDF of the PowerPoint as well.
Peter said, he asked me a question. I said, do you think they have some Jewish, players? I said, they probably.
There's although kids don't read these days, but I mean, there are wonderful biographies, both of Greenberg and Koufax. Some of the 9-year-old, I mean, there are some that are written for that age group. There are also some that are for a little bit older. The Jewish Lives series has a great one on Greenberg. I assume they have one on Koufax, but I haven't read that. But Jane Levy's biography of Koufax is fantastic. That's probably not for a 9-year-old, but it's really very good.
And also, like, just U.S., like, how you get Jewish celebrity lists? You can do the same thing for a search for Jewish athletes, American Jewish athletes, and you'll get hundreds of them.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I have a question about the fact that Jews broke into America as boxers and fighters. And I didn't know whether that was because they were the only thing they were allowed to do. But I thought it was an interesting piece of the history.
Yeah. I'm not a historian, so some of this is secondhand. But my working theory on that is also that's a very common pattern for minority groups, is to break in through boxing or other fighting sports. Now, part of that is because at the end of the day, it's you in the ring. And if you're able to do it, you can do it, and people aren't going to care much about that. And it's easier to get involved to some extent, right? Because Jews live in the city, right? And it's the same why I think baseball is a major thing. We think of baseball as a kind of pastoral sport, but it really was a city sport, right? It grew and developed in the major cities where Jews were. Same with basketball. And Jews were very influential. You mentioned Red Auerbach, but professional basketball gets its start from I think it's like the Philadelphia Hebrew, I forget the full name of it, but it was a Jewish organizational basketball that started really paying their players first. And so that's really the start of the NBA in many ways. And so, yeah, very early on, the early 1900s, late 1800s, there were many Jewish boxers and they were very popular, and there was a following for that. But with the next generation, that didn't continue, which is again a very standard pattern for immigrant groups.
If I can also add to that, like in the boxing arena, in England that was very important, how Jews broke into sports. So specifically in the 18th century, Daniel Mendoza might have been one of the most famous boxers in 18th century England, a Portuguese Jew, who also wrote an autobiography that's in English. That's so you can kind of access it that way.
And there's a fictionalized version of that. I think the author is David Liss.
Oh, really?
And there's a series, and he's a former boxer, and now he's a thief catcher. So it's a mystery story, right? So he goes and captures thieves.
I didn't know
but
about that.
yeah, it's very fun.
And also on the basketball front, the CCNY basketball team in the 1950s that was like largely Jewish and also black, and so that was a story of integration. And also there's been a lot of literature about that specific story, about the late 40s and early 50s. I think it was 51, the scandal.
I was just going to mention, and then there's the scandal as well. And one of the things I talked I mentioned the Shondas of Ryan Braun and Donald Sterling, but
Bregman a little bit too.
What?
Even Bregman a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I guess now he's on the Cubs, so fine. Yeah, that's good. No, but I was going to the 1919 Black Sox scandal and the alleged involvement of Jewish mafia in organizing that, and so that element as well is also prevalent in sports. Jewish owners, Jewish gamblers are part of the story as well, but that's less connected to the fandom, so I didn't focus on that as much.
I just had a quick question. I know that you mentioned the Israeli team that'll be in the Olympics for bobsledding.
Yes.
So where do they practice and how did they come to be?
I'll have to refer you to A.J. Edelman because he's the one who's really organized it. I mean, they practice in the Olympic facilities, probably Lake Placid and other places in the U.S. and in Europe. Yeah, they're probably more in Europe because it's very expensive. It's like $20,000 to ship one of those bobsleds. So you don't want to move that around too much. And obviously they can't practice in Israel. Yes, right. Edelman is Israeli, but he was born in the U.S. And I think most of the other team members are Israeli. I don't know where they live, but that's actually the case for most Olympic athletes. Most of them train in Europe and the U.S. anyway. Yeah.
First of all, I'm just curious. Amari Stoudemire became a Jew and moved to Israel, and there was a fairly significant backlash against him, I think, in the United States when he did that. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I wasn't aware of the backlash. Okay. I'm aware of, he played basketball in Israel for a period. I think that's where
I think he's still playing.
Yeah, is he still playing? Really?
Maybe coaching. I don't know.
Maybe he's coaching. But correct me if I'm wrong. Part of his conversion process began because he was playing in Israel. So he went there first just to play, I believe.
Amari Stoudemire. He was a Sun, I think. Yeah. He was a Phoenix Sun, and then he went over to Israel and was on the national team there, and converted. I think he's converted to Orthodox Judaism.
Yeah, no, it's more of a traditional approach. I believe he went there to play in the basketball league because basketball and soccer are the most popular sports in Israel. Yeah. Baseball not so much, bobsledding not so much, but basketball is huge. In basketball and soccer, they compete in the international level as well in Europe and elsewhere. So.
Okay, so my last question. Sorry, I had two. I'm curious. This idea of fanaticism kind of jumped into my head when we were talking about this as a program, and I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on religious fanaticism versus sports fanaticism or team fanaticism.
Well, I think the latter is far more healthy.
Maybe.
At least maybe for society, maybe not so much for the individual. Well, one thing that popped in my head that I wanted to say is that we often think of fan as short for fanatic, and that's not necessarily true. The etymology of our use of fan for sports fans is a bit obscure. We're not really sure where it might come more from the term I always think of this like the Cat Fancy magazine, right? And so fan might actually be short for fancy, right? Some even have argued that it's because when you went to the games, you had to hold a fan, right? And that I'm less convinced on that one, right? But and so it's probably it's probably double. The word gets pulled in double ways. But in terms of just sports fanaticism, whether it's connected to the word fan or not, right? I think there are. So the gentleman in the back mentioned the escapism in a sense of sport, which I think is true. I don't think that's wholly true or entirely true or the entire story for everybody. But I do think there is a sense of sport as a place to go to that's different than the regular world, right? For good and bad reasons. Some of it could be because you're trying to escape from things in your life that you don't want to deal with. Some of it could be more positive in the sense that it's hard to know when you're successful in life, right? It can take a long time to produce, like as academics, right? It can take a long time to produce a book, right? And I haven't updated my bio because I actually have a new book that came out just in the last, when did that come? December 11th, on college sports ethics.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it's in that book series, but it's 10 years after the previous one, right? And not that I've been working on it for 10 years, but it actually has its origins. I think the first email I had with my co-editor was probably 2021, right? And so that's not like, it's not building the cathedral in Barcelona long, but it's a long time to work on a project. And then I've gotten some nice feedback from some people, right? But you don't ever really know how successful it was. But when you play sports or you watch sports, you know at the end of the game whether you were successful or not. And that's not the same as win or lose, because you can lose and still be successful, right? You can break the previous world record as a swimmer and still lose the race because the person in front of you just went that much faster, right? And so you still came in second, but you did break the world record. That's still excellence, right? But you can know that. You can know whether you succeeded in your goals or not at the end of the game, the match, whatnot. And so I think that's part of the draw of sport as well, both in terms of the athlete, but also the fan. You know when it's over, whether your team's going on to Santa Clara or not. I'll know today, right? And so that's different than in life, where we often don't know whether we're successful. It takes a long time and a lot of processing to know whether our career was successful, because we don't have stats for our careers. So even though our administrators sometimes want to try to give us stats, but those don't really capture the reality of things.
So just to end, I think there's more Jewish athletes now
Yeah.
in the pro sports than there were ever.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Without even really looking closely at the numbers, I would be surprised if that wasn't the case.
Okay, anything on Zoom? No, we're good? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Klein.